November 18, 1942. The air above Guadalcanal is thin, freezing and silent, save for the drone of a Nakajima engine. High above Henderson Field, the gloved hand of an unnamed Japanese Zero pilot tightens around his control stick. He is scanning the horizon, eyes narrowed against the glare of the Pacific sun, expecting the usual clumsy American prey. But what breaks the cloud layer below him is a silhouette that defies logic. It is not the stubby shape of a wildcat, nor the slender frame of a warhawk. It is a monster with two tails, climbing upward with a violence that seems to ignore gravity entirely. On this day, the pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron are not just flying a new aircraft. They are ushering in the death of an empire's aerial dominance. Through the plexiglass of his canopy, the Japanese pilot watches in horror as the American fighters, the P-38, lightnings ascend from sea level to combat altitude faster than his Mitsubishi A6M Zero can follow. For 3 years, in the skies over China, the Philippines, and the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor, the Zero has reigned as the untouchable king of the Pacific. It was the sword of the emperor, agile and deadly. But here, above this blood-soaked jungle island, the mathematics of war are changing. The American pilots engage, claiming 3 kills and a blur of speed and nose-mounted firepower. They dictate the terms. They choose the altitude. And in the debriefing rooms back at Rabor, the trembling reports of surviving pilots reveal the first hairline fractures in the myth of Japanese invincibility. The collapse of the rising sun's air superiority did not happen overnight, though the seeds were sown long before that November morning. Since the devastation of December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy aviators had swept across the ocean with the swagger of untouchables. The Mitsubishi Zero was a masterpiece of aeronautical origami flight, possessing an impossible range and capable of turning on a dime. Its pilots, men like the legendary petty officer First Class Saburo Sakai, were modern-day samurai. Sakai, a veteran of the China campaign with blood on his hands and ice in his veins, had carved a path of destruction across the Pacific. By the time he reached Lae, New Guinea, his confidence was absolute. His commander, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, had assured them that the Americans were flying inferior Navy Wildcats, sluggish machines that could be toyed with and discarded. And for the early months of 1942, history seemed to agree. The Japanese had swatted Brewster Buffaloes out of the sky over Singapore and decimated P-40 Warhawks over Java. They were the masters of the dogfight, an art form they had perfected. But intelligence reports began to trickle into the Japanese mess halls. Whispers of a twin-tailed devil that carried heavy armament in its nose and flew like a locomotive. Most commanders dismissed the rumors. How could a heavy twin-engine beast threaten the nimble Zero? Their doctrine, built on the elegance of the turning fight, had no framework to understand the brute force that was coming for them. The P-38 Lightning was not a dogfighter. It was a vision of the future forged in aluminum. Born from the mind of Lockheed's Clarence Kelly Johnson, it was the answer to a question the Japanese hadn't yet asked. Designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it was a machine of extremes. Twin Allison V1710 engines, turbo superchargers screaming to produce 1,150 horsepower each, and a top speed that shattered the 400-mile-per-hour barrier. While the Zero was built like a kite sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for maneuverability, the Lightning was a flying tank. It represented a strictly American philosophy: speed, altitude, firepower, and survivability. When the first P-38s arrived in the Pacific, they were plagued by mechanical gremlins, teething issues of a complex machine in a primitive war. But as 1942 bled into 1943, experienced pilots from the 49th Fighter Group began to tame the beast. These men had learned the hard way, watching their friends die in turning fights with Zeros. They knew better now. They wouldn't turn. They would slash. The shock of the new reality hit home during the Lightning's first major engagements over the Solomons. Japanese bomber escorts, spotting the strange shapes rising from the south, paused in confusion. Were they bombers? Reconnaissance planes? By the time the realization struck, it was too late. The P-38s had already seized the high ground, lurking thousands of feet above the Zero's effective ceiling. Then, the dive. The American fighters tipped their noses down and became thunderbolts, screaming down at speeds that turned the Zero's controls into concrete. The physics were merciless. Above 300 miles per hour, the Zero became a brick, its legendary agility vanishing under the crushing force of high-speed aerodynamics. The P-38, with hydraulic ferocity, plunged through the Japanese formation, unleashed a torrent of 50 caliber and 20 millimeter fire, and zoomed back up into the sun before the Japanese could even bring their guns to bear. It was not a duel. It was an execution. This technological chasm began to rot the psychological core of the Japanese pilot corps. The P-38 was not just a plane. It was a predator that broke the rules of engagement. Its guns were clustered in the nose, creating a buzzsaw of lead that didn't require the complex convergence calculations of wing-mounted weapons. And it was quiet. The turbo superchargers muffled the exhaust, meaning the Lightning often arrived before the sound of its own engines. For the Japanese, whose engines gasped for air above 20,000 feet, seeing the twin-boomed giants loitering comfortably in the stratosphere was demoralizing. Saburo Sakai, the ace of aces, eventually admitted the grim truth. It was impossible to engage the P-38 on equal terms. The decisive battle doctrine of the Japanese Navy was unraveling. The Lightning could appear anywhere, its massive fuel tanks allowing it to range 1,000 miles from base, turning the vast safety of the Pacific into a hunting ground. The ultimate demonstration of this reach came on April 18, 1943, Operation Vengeance. In a mission that seemed pulled from fiction, 16 P-38s launched a meticulously calculated assassination attempt against the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Flying 50 feet above the wavetops to evade radar, battling heat and navigation exhaustion, the American pilots intercepted Yamamoto's transport bomber with terrifying precision. Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, flying escort that day, watched in helpless horror. The Lightnings appeared from nowhere, slashed through the formation, and sent the Admiral crashing into the jungle. It was a surgical strike that severed the head of the Japanese Navy, proving that no one, not even the most revered leader, was safe from the twin-tailed ghost. As the war ground on, the tactics evolved, but the outcome remained the same. The boom and zoom, diving, firing, and climbing away became the standard operating procedure for American pilots. The Japanese tried everything to counter it. They used dive breaks, they flew in loose formations, they tried to bait the Americans into low-altitude mud, but the P-38 pilots refused to take the bait. The disparity was not just in the cockpit, it was on the assembly line. The P-38 was a product of a system of continuous improvement. The J model arrived with dive flaps to combat compressibility and boosted. ailerons that allowed it to roll like a much smaller plane. Meanwhile, the Japanese were still flying the Zero, essentially the same aircraft that had started the war, now hopelessly outclassed. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius of the Imperial Navy, privately confessed that they were fighting a losing battle against a system of industrial evolution they could not match. The human cost of this technological gap was catastrophic. By mid-1943, Japan was hemorrhaging its samurai. The experienced veterans were dying, replaced by boys with barely 200 hours of flight time. Conversely, American pilots were arriving in the Pacific with hundreds of hours of training, having mastered deflection, shooting, and high-altitude physiology before they ever saw a Japanese plane. The P-38's twin engines offered a final, cruel advantage: survivability. A zero hit in the fuel tank was a funeral pyre. A P-38 with an engine shot out could limp home on one lung. The psychological weight of this was crushing. Japanese pilots knew that a single mistake meant death. American pilots knew their machine would fight to keep them alive. Captured documents from late 1943 revealed the depth of the fear. Japanese commanders were ordering their pilots to run. The P-38 must be considered the most dangerous American aircraft, the orders read. The warrior code of Bushido had been silenced by the roar of Allison engines. The scorecards of the American aces told the story in cold numbers. Major Richard Bong and Major Thomas McGuire, the two top-scoring American aces of the war, flew nothing but the Lightning. Together, they accounted for 78 enemy aircraft. But the statistic that mattered most was the attrition. Over 1,800 Japanese aircraft fell to the guns of the P-38 in the Pacific. Each victory was not just a machine destroyed, but a veteran pilot lost a repository of skill and experience that Japan could never replace. By 1944, the Lightning had evolved into a multi-role monster, carrying bombs and rockets, strafing airfields and shipping with impunity. It was no longer just fighting for air superiority. It was dismantling the Japanese war machine piece by piece. The cultural shock was perhaps the deepest wound. The Japanese had treated aerial combat as a martial art, a duel of spirits. The Americans treated it as an engineering problem. Commander Masatake Okumiya later wrote of the bitter realization that fighting spirit alone was insufficient. The P-38 forced a reckoning with modernity. When the Marianas Turkey Shoot occurred in 1944, where hundreds of Japanese planes were swatted from the sky, it was the tombstone of a dying doctrine. The P-38 had already done the heavy lifting, stripping away the elite cadre of Japanese aviators, leaving only sacrificial lambs to face the U.S. Navy's HELLCATS. By 1945, the sky belonged to the Allies. The P-38, now equipped with radar for night fighting and heavy ordnance for ground attack, roamed the skies over the Japanese home islands. The desperate attempts to counter it tramming attacks, phosphorus shells, and the failed development of the Kawasaki Ki-102 were the thrashing of a dying beast. Saburo Sakai, surviving against all odds, looked up at the sky and saw the end of the world he knew. The P-38 had destroyed the morale of the Zero pilot, not just by shooting him down, but by rendering his skill irrelevant. Post-war interrogations laid bare the trauma. Japanese pilots spoke of the P-38 with a mixture of hatred and awe. It was the machine that proved their worldview wrong. The Zero was a beautiful anachronism. The Lightning was the industrial age weaponized. It was faster, stronger, and built in numbers that defied comprehension. While Japan hand-built its engines, America poured P-38s out of factories like automobiles. The training disparity was the final insult. American pilots were professionals. Japanese pilots, by the end, were martyrs. The letters home from these young men, resigned to their fiery fate, are a haunting testament to a war lost long before the final shots were fired. The legacy of the P-38 Lightning is etched in the history of aerial warfare. It was the instrument that broke the back of the Japanese Navy Air Service. It ended the era of the dogfight and ushered in the age of energy maneuverability. But its true impact was visible in the eyes of the men who fought against it. For the pilots of the rising sun, the twin-tailed silhouette was the Grim Reaper, a silver flash that signaled the end of the samurai era. In the unforgiving skies of the Pacific, technology and industry had met tradition and courage, and the result was total, devastating victory. The P-38 didn't just win battles. It shattered the spirit of an enemy who believed they could not be defeated. It was the terrifying, undeniable proof that the future had arrived, and it was powered by two engines, flying at 40,000 feet, looking down on a world that would never be the same.